Good morning, everyone. My name is Khadr Khadour. I'm a researcher at Carnegie. Our sessions today will be both in English and Arabic, so if you need interpretation, please raise your hands.
Yes. The lady there. طيب عظيم.
Excellent. I would like to thank you all for your presence. Our session today is organized in coordination with the International Crisis Group. We will also have live streaming. Our topic today is on the central government and emergence of local powers and communities in Syria and the situation of localization in Syria. We decided to work on this topic in order to understand how administration is conducted outside the government institutions in light of the recent military developments, which show that the Syrian army is gaining field. We know that we have a crisis between the center and local regions. Since the end of 2012, the central government in Damascus is trying to get away with any action which comes outside of the center by trying to destroy totally the region and killing its people. During the last years, the local communities have been supported through local councils and governments or by helping local societies to contribute to a political situation or to create a safety network in case the government in Damascus witnesses some changes. Therefore, the government in Damascus, as I said, was trying to get done with any local then we noticed that we started to witness an upsurge in the local administrations in order to try to constitute a counterpower or an alternative power to the government in Damascus. Centralized discussions and many submitted and this
أعمدة الحل الرئيسية في سوريا وهناك مجموعات ذهبت إلى أبعد من اللامركزية كجماعة حزب العمال الكردستاني الPKK إلى نموذج فيدرالي. بكل الحالات يعني إن كان فيدرالية لمركزية، لمركزية موسعة، لمركزية إدارية، أيا كانت مناقشتها اليوم المركز والمحليات. في الجلسة الأولى سوف تقيم الجلسة الأولى
political people. During the second session, we will be discussing the influence of local dynamics on the policies of external actors. We will also be discussing the possible opportunities and future horizons. During the first session, we have among us Maria Fantapie. She's a senior analyst on Iraq and Kurdish issues group. We have also Dr. Ammar Kaf, and he's the executive director of Omran for Strategic Studies, and he's also a member of the board of directors of the Syrian Forum. We also have Sam Hiller, and he's a fellow at the Century Foundation. I would like to welcome you, and Sam, we will start with you. You have the floor.
For having me. I'm going to be talking about a paper that I published this week through the Century Foundation about local administration, municipal services, and the role of armed groups in Idlib province specifically. So my notes are on my phone, so if I look down at it, I'm not tweeting. I'm just checking those just for reference. Idlib now is the center of the opposition-held Northwest, and then it is run at the city and town level by municipal local councils that coordinate the distribution of relief and then also provide some municipal services of mixed quality. Above the local level, you have some provincial and national level bodies, including the Idlib Provincial Council, that in practice seem to have some limited influence at the local level. These councils, they also have to contend with a number of other more immediate interest groups, including powerful local families, local rebels, and most importantly, it's Muslimat, or just organizations. And that's sort of the catch-all term that's used for development contractors, for relief NGOs, for charities, all these organizations that provide outside assistance. Idlib, in terms of armed control is largely divided between Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat Fath al-Sham, previously Syrian al-Qaeda affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra. There are other factions at work, and then, but a lot of them seem to services and governance, either by establishing service bodies. So what we see is that these armed groups, even as they are fighting a war against the Assad regime, they're simultaneously experimenting with political order in this province. So Ahrar has backed a linked service body. Jabhat Fath al-Sham has imported its own service body up from Aleppo city. It brought it down to Idlib. And then together, they they have jointly invested in the Jaysh al-Fatah, the Army of Conquest administration that's based out of Idlib City. All these bodies originated in 2015. And so they were a reaction in large part to rebels' capture of nearly all of Idlib province, which opened up new space for political projects and experimentation. But in terms of how these bodies are organized and how they function and relate to others, a lot of it seems to be a reaction to the centrality of local councils in terms of assistance dynamics. So the local councils, they are an experiment in participatory local governance. They're novel in that sense. But they're also, they've been set up as the main vehicle for the delivery of assistance to these towns, including relief and also more resource-intensive services, kind of equipment for trash disposal, for electricity provision, for water pumping. And the donor relations here, so the donor bodies that finance relief and these services, their relationships seem to largely run directly down to the local council level. The provincial council is a little bit, the local councils have some political content to them, but the provincial council is just a more explicitly political project. It's part of a superstructure of opposition institutions that were meant to collectively form an alternative to Assad regime institutions and control. And so you have some donor bodies with a more political mission, like USAID, OTI, that have directed their support through the provincial council. But many other more humanitarian organizations, for them, I don't think that the politics of this are necessarily that relevant. So for them, they just want to coordinate with a responsible local partner and ensure that their assistance is distributed properly. And so many of them just work directly with the local councils. What that means is that the provincial council has limited real oversight capacity or influence over the local councils. And that often there isn't really anyone to to organize these local authorities or to keep them in check when in some instances they misbehave. That's provided an opening for some alternatives, particularly the Ahrar Sham-linked body, which provides some services, but has also set itself up as a coordinating and an oversight authority. It's also created incentives for armed groups to try to co-opt or control local councils, just because of because so much of the relief, the assistance runs through them, and then potentially an attempt to kind of capture some of their legitimacy. And when they do it, they typically need to engage with local councils in place, because in instances where they've tried to build these kinds of bodies from scratch, they've often been rebuffed by donors who insist on dealing with civilian local councils. So I went into this thinking that I was going to be writing about, I went into this project, conducting these interviews, thinking that I was going to be writing about a race for control of the province between the provincial council and this Ahrar Sham-linked body, the Nusra body, and that, I mean, honestly, I thought that Ahrar was going to be winning. Just because the way that they've set this up, it's a little bit more politically sophisticated. I thought that they were positioning themselves potentially to be the connective tissue between these local bodies in a way that could displace maybe the provincial council or even some donor organizations like USAID. But instead, if this is a race, it seems like no one is really winning. Localism is winning. So what you end up with is you end up with areas that are supported by the Ahrar Sham-linked body. You end up with Jabhat al-Nusra areas. The Jaish al-Fatah body is still in Idlib city, and then 2 other urban areas. And it's and so the Jaish al-Fatah body, its ambitions to become like a bigger, more kind of provincial level or even national level authority, it seems like they've been frustrated by donor resistance and by just kind of dynamics on the ground. And in terms of how kind of governance works in any of these areas, it seems like all of this is governed primarily by just local specificity. Just at the town level, what families are there, what factions are there, what arrangements they strike that are the most kind of locally appropriate. And this tendency towards localism seems like it has been exacerbated and really entrenched by these aid dynamics. So the result is that you end up with an Idlib where at least the governance and the service sector is largely, it's atomized. It's local. And so you have these novel experiments in governance at the local level, but then you don't really have that much effectively holding it together above that.
شكرا سام. ناخذ من عمار، تفضل عمار.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like, we cannot hear him. The microphone is off. Can you ask him to talk on the microphone, please? We cannot hear him. So we see that the cities in Syria represent many different experiences. Can he speak in the microphone?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? All right, so كأنه عم يقطع شوي. No. الو سامعني؟ الو اوكي سألخص بعض النقاط.
I will try to summarize some points in light of the studies that we conducted at Omran Center. We had some studies on the councils in Idlib, and we also studied several phenomena such as the financial deficit. The microphone is off again. So we studied many different phenomena. No, it's working now. It's okay. I will try to summarize some of the elements related to local councils and their experiences in many of the opposition areas. And this is instrumental to assessing the current period. First off, the councils were characterized by the periodic elections, many different election stages, and in comparison with the experiences with factions, and here we had several studies based on our experiences. However, in comparison, the local councils, which were localized in the opposition areas and the south and the north, or in any other areas, so many of those cases, and also I have census which included more than 150 councils in 2015. 30% are based on elections, and approximately 60% or 70% are based on consensus, community consensus. Concerning the remaining ones, they were either appointed by factions or they were appointed by virtue of a personal initiative without any opposition. So we have this legitimate election and the voice of the streets. We had an improvement on this level because in the past we did not have the same strength. We were able to notice improvements during the past 4 or 5 years. There is also an infrastructure, an administrative structure which starts with the smaller city councils to arrive to the provincial council. First of all, many of the provincial councils were either absent or were very weak. I'll give you the example of the Council of Dir'a. We have 76 smaller council. They appointed or nominated people to this council. So they just nominate persons to be part of the provincial councils. We had the same thing in Idlib with some differences in comparison with Daraa. We also have an increasing organizational role in these councils. As I said, provincial councils during the past 5 years had an increasing role. We had, first of all, the Aleppo Council or the Aleppo Provincial Council, which witnessed some problems at the beginning. The smaller city councils were strong, but in the past years, the Aleppo Council became a body which includes the votes and voices of the smaller councils. Local councils started to play political roles, and we conducted a study on 150 local councils to know what their opinion is. And this was conducted in May 2016. 57% consider that, or 57% of these councils consider that their role is limited to services. 42% consider that their role is both political and service-based, and this arises from the study that we conducted in 2015 on the role that local councils perceive for themselves. We also witnessed an increase in the financial deficit, and this is an important issue that we should point out. For instance, the OCHA tries to prevent organizations to not deal with the claims of local councils, and this is an organization which supports councils, especially in Gaziantep. And we also have the southern cross borders where some threats issued, and therefore all the organizations which signed the boycott petition were sanctioned by being deprived from any donations for 2016 because they did not share information to the HRP and to the information structure of the OCHA in Gaziantep area. We also witness a lack of an investment environment. There's instability in many councils, and therefore many of these councils suffer from financial deficit, and this was the main reason behind our study on the failed local councils. The main reason was the insufficient financial support, and the councils which barely obtained support, or if they obtain support, this support will be suspended suddenly. If I had a presentation, I would have provided you with the statistics, but I can provide you later on with my presentation with the relevant statistics. There's also a phenomenon between local councils and the opposition bodies, and this also appeared clearly from statistics. Approximately 55%, based on the last study in 2015, said that they support the higher body for negotiation, and the relationship with the provisional government is probably stronger than the coalition in terms of extent and scope, and the government at the outset provided them with some financial support, hence the different relationship with it. So we may say that the majority is unified by an internal statute which is related to Law 107. Although the council's structure changed the dynamic concerning water project 20%, health 14%, so the projects that are conducted through councils are based on needs, and this is a very positive thing. 64% said that the support is delayed, and one of the relief organizations that I studied said that when claims or demands are submitted to the European Union, require 1.5 years to be dealt with, and meanwhile the situation on the field would have totally changed and needs another study, another form of bureaucracy in terms of support. I have a case study and I can prove this. More than 1.5 years from the approval of the contract, and in order for the contract to be sent, this requires 6 months, then many revisions, and by then the situation on the field would have changed totally, and this represents 64% of the cases that we examined. The support is in kind for 59% of the cases, in cash for 41% of the cases. So 405 local councils were examined. They have their own accountancy and they adopt receipts whenever they receive money. So they have books. 68% have their own regulations. 17% do not have regulations that are approved through a general authority, and 14.2% rely on the regulations of the local administration. I also said that 55% were formed by consensus, and these are the statistics of 2015. Approximately 35% were formed through elections, and some of them were elected directly by the citizens depending on the security situation. And we asked about the reasons behind the hurdles faced by elections. We were told that it was the lack of awareness to the importance of elections, and in some areas, in addition to the lack of awareness, we had security obstacles, and 7.4% of the 405 local councils said that they faced problems due to the intervention of the army and military officers. We may read this on the social media, of course, and we know that the statistics do not represent an absolute truth. I don't want to go excited and enthusiastic about those figures, but they are interesting. We also examined the participation of women in those local councils, and the most important reason was not related to the intervention of the armed officers, that is 9%, but the reasons were related to the security obstacles and pressures which go against the participation of women. Moreover, there are not enough structures or suitable structures that support women's participation to political life. In 2016, the majority said that councils play a service-related role and role in order to cater for civil and social peace. In 2016, 57% said that elections were made through consensus and 38% through elections. What about the relationship with the armed people? 37% said that it was good, and these are the statistics of 2016. Many of the problems that appeared in 2015 and 2016 between the local councils and the army are now obsolete, and this is one of the pillars that we studies when we talked about the councils affiliated to factions. They have a small geographic area in general, but as Mr. Sam said, they are localized and they are very limited. They're limited in a small town, for instance, in Frambil, in the south of Idlib. We have the example of a vibrant civil society. We have the well-known Mosiah Center, and a person who was arrested by Nusra and he was released. He was not killed. So this means that there is a good relationship between the citizens in Kafranbil and with the local council and the civil society organizations. Therefore, and despite all the challenges represented by the interventions of Jabhat al-Nusra in Kafranbil, I think that we have also a high role that is played by the citizens. At the north of Idlib, we have the same example, and we also have citizens who were able to kick the Nusra out of their provinces. The more local councils are strong, the more the relationship between those councils and the citizens get tighter and stronger, and the more we are able to exclude terrorism and radicalism from those provinces, and the better the relationships among the councils. And we were able to notice this in the statistics that we studied. We were able to study the relationship with the provincial councils and with the councils in towns. Therefore, the issue of localization, which we saw on the councils which are affiliated to factions, grew weaker in councils which are based on elections and consensus. And I have a diagram here which shows how councils which were elected or appointed by consensus had more positive relationships with other councils.
There are the councils that are attached to the factions, to the opposition in general. There is a problematic in references of these councils. There is also problems in terms of the duality of the projects and in terms of the relationship with the local population. A lot of international organizations and countries do not thus deal a lot with those local councils, because they are really localized in small areas or villages. And also there is another point regarding the absence of political consensus between these councils and the local population, and we have undertaken a study regarding the development of projects in these areas, and we discovered that there are no development projects or initiatives launched in these villages. The local administrations, one could say, what about Daesh? What about ISIS? During the last 2 years, there were some decisions taken by ISIS as not to intervene in local councils. In Der Zura, for example, some areas allowed the councils to continue, then they stopped them, and then they moved to a phase of a decentralization. And after the International Alliance Against ISIS, there was a decentralization in the ISIS-controlled areas, i.e. councils that provided the services and that had more authorities and powers. But there was also the problem of legitimacy that was very weak. This is why there is no organized relationship between the local population and those councils. In addition to problems related to governance, to the increasing tensions, to the increasing military confrontations. And one could say that, for example, in the area of the Druze in Syria, there was a movement of the sheikhs, but it is still an emerging and very young initiative, especially in the Suwaida region. But it depends more on their ability to maintain security and social cohesion in these areas. Maybe in the upcoming period, these issues could vary or could become different. We are trying now to establish a decentralized administration, but there is a real and deep problem between, in terms of the relationship between the local population and the councils. The regime now is depending on the security apparatus, and all of the councils in the areas under its control are now consecrated to preserve those security bodies and apparatus. In the mechanism of sustaining or of supporting those local councils, the international organizations should focus on these councils in terms of their ability to sustain the state institutions. Those local councils should be given the authority to play some roles, to play some functions like providing services, civil services, divorce services, or marriage services. More the local councils can undertake or can play this role, we would ensure a better political transition, whether the regime stays or collapses. And in order for this transition to be smooth, the local councils should work according to a structure that is close to the structure existing in other areas. They have to be dealt with as state institutions, but a lot of organizations deal with those councils as civil society organizations, while they are structures for the local governance mechanisms. It is not up to the local council, for example, to distribute food and drinks. They have to organize the work, to supervise it, and we should also focus on providing the basic services to people. because when the local councils provide such services to the population, they gain legitimacy and they contribute to the social structure and to the social network, and thus the councils could become a part of the security apparatus to protect the local population. A lot of local councils think that they play a role in social cohesion. This is why maybe we should shed a light on the role of these local councils in creating again this is social cohesion. Even in Latakia, for example, some council that existed there were working on social cohesion, but this experience did not last long because of the military force that invaded that country. Then we have the point related to the social development projects. In order for these local councils to lead the reconstruction built from now on, it will be, of course, a gradual process, be it horizontally or vertically. It will not be a reconstruction process taking place at the same level or at the same degree in all areas. According at least to international data and to the situation in Syria, I do not think that we will have a day zero in order to start this reconstruction process. They will not be a day to for us to say they will be another day and then we have to start from scratch. This is why the local councils should be based on the sustainability of the state institutions, on the social cohesion, on the ability to provide the basic services to local population and to achieve also local development. Thank you.
Pleasure to come back to Carnegie and to speak in front of this distinguished audience. I'm going to focus my speech on the Idara Zatiya, which is the self-administration which has emerged in northern Syria, in those areas where Kurds are basically living. There are three main pockets in the North Syria, and since July 2012, after the Syrian branch of the PKK entered in Syria, there has been, as you all are aware, a process of building up a sort of local institutions in these areas. And we reached the point where actually at first glance we can say that one could say that this administration of northern Syria, this, let's say, Kurdish experiment in northern Syria, it's among the others that are inside Syria in terms of local administration, the one that is most successful. I mean, at first glance, one can say that. In fact, also not at first glance, while visiting these places, one can actually visit ministers, so people who are appointed as Ministry of Electricity, Ministry of Education, Ministry of different responsible for the local security, so on and so forth. So most of the elements of the states seems to be there and present. They also, when you are actually going to visit these people, they also have specific buildings which were previously owned by the Syrian state and now they're managed by the Syrian branch of the PKK. So you actually have the feeling that you are in a very highly organized and sophisticated administrative structure. They also have their own symbols, the administration or the self-administration or Idara Zatiya, so-called Rojava. It has also its own symbologies, and also beside that, there had been a fast-paced expansion of this administration. We started in 2013 with a project of 3 cantons in Syria, and we reached, as of 2016, in a setting where actually this administration aims at almost covering the entirety of northern Syria, if I'm not wrong, under a new project which is called the Federaliyet al-Shemal, so Federalism, Northern Federalist region of Syria. So I think that it's quite interesting to understand and evaluate to what extent this administration is really a first embryonic element of a future decentralization project for the entire Syria. And it's quite important, I think, to discuss that because the debate over the Kurdish issue and this administration, both in academic circle and among political analysts, it has been quite polarized until now. You find, as also in Europe, those who are extremely supportive of this administration and see in this administration really the premises of successful, not only successful decentralization, but even a successful model for self-governance of local societies, which also European society could learn from, inspired of gender equality and ecology and so on and so forth. And you have another, on the other side, you have harsh critics coming against this administration, people saying that this administration have been built in cooperation of a secret deal and agreement between the PKK and the regime. So what I want to try to do is really to have an objective analysis as much as possible what this administration is, and trying to jump beyond, to overcome this polarized debate on the Kurdish issue and on the PKK, and try to provide really an assessment on whether this administration can be considered or not a first embryonic form of decentralization in Syria. I think that attempting to answer this question, we have to understand why we have been so, I mean, as general public, and I say we as Western also, we have been so much charmed by this project of the PKK in Syria. And I think that we have been charmed by it because also it really provided at first glance this administrative structures and the form of organization. But one, beyond the structure, should also think about how actually the devolution of power, how power flows. Is power, one thing are the structures, one thing are the ministries and the buildings and all that, and one thing is the decision-making process. So we have to try, I think, to understand whether this is a decentralization or not from the central government. We have to understand whether how power flows within this institution, if power flows within these institutions. And I mean, my assessment after having visited the area with colleagues, it's that basically the administration of Rojava, first of all, was born also as an attempt in a way of a political party to sort of to organize the local society. There was really a need to, in a way, create a connection between the PKK Syrian branch, the PYD, and the Syrian Kurdish society. This because, let's not forget that the Syrian Kurdish society was, I mean, the PKK did not have a long history, let's say, in northern Syria. It had a history of presence in northern Syria, but it did not had a presence of managing the society. This role was always, let's say, conducted and mostly led by other Kurdish political parties, which also through the past 50 years and more had been the main interlocutor of the regime. So the PKK was a sort of foreign actor in the Syrian Kurdish society. So the administration has borne in an attempt, I think, also to sort of organize and to some extent also to co-opt some of the elements of the Kurdish society and the minorities living beside this Kurdish society. And then I would say that if we, so basically when we speak to these ministries, if we look at the profile of these ministries, Ministry of Electricity, Ministry of Education, we see that these people are not that, not part of that urban middle class which was traditionally on the lead in this area. Not in the case of Afrin, but I'm talking about mostly on the case of the Jazeera. So that urban middle class that generally was on the lead as the head of the local institutions or had roles in the Syrian state institution. These people are not this type of people, but are rather people who are had been unknown, let's say, in the local context, and also found in the administration of the PYD a hope for social climbing. So that worked well to some extent, at least to have the framework of institutions. But unfortunately, precisely because these individuals and these structures are sort of exported and not actually coming bottom up, but just created on the other, created as external bodies and led by people who are not necessarily linked to the ground. Because of that, the decision-making power, it's not inside this institution. So the decision-making power, it's outside this institution, and it rests, unfortunately, until today in the military chain of command of the PKK Syrian branch. So this, you might have read already this in several publications, but it's important to understand that and to clarify that this is still until today the reality of fact. So the decision-making, it's in the chain of command of the political party structure. So if there is a decision to be made about key issues like how to provide electricity, how much oil to pump from Rumelan oil field, all these strategic decisions are not made by the Ministry of Electricity, but they are made by the military commander who might be Syrian, but who has been trained in PKK base in Kandil, and who will decide about that eventually. So power is outside the institution, in a nutshell. And on this on one hand, and on the other hand, there is also another problem, more from the civil-military relation, that the military is busy controlling the civilian, and not the civilian is controlling the military. So you have a double problem there that is unresolved. So I would say that the PKK, in a nutshell, has supported structures of decentralization, but remains in a highly centralized system as a party. So that is a bit of a contradiction, but is not something specific to the PKK. In Iraq, the KDP, it is very similar to some extent. It has pushed for decentralization and so much claim decentralization, and then its political party apparatus, I mean, are basically the decision makers. And this is an extremely centralized system of decision making. So there is in the entire Kurdish platform a problem of how to also implement decentralization and how to build institutions which are outside the political party structure, and how to devolve power from the political party to the institution. Then proceeding, we can say that although we can conclude in some way that this administration is not a decentralized administration, but there are structures of decentralization, we don't have to undermine the fact that has been already mentioned by both my predecessor, Samer and Omar, that the local society had also an important role in this area in forcing the PKK to localize. So basically, the administration is not decentralized, but it has, the context of the conflict has forced the PKK to decentralize, to produce local structure in order to, in a way, stick with the society. So, for instance, now we see the development of PKK-affiliated Syrian military academies, which in the past, these military academies were only in Kandil, which is the headquarters of PKK, but now you have military academies in Syria. And also more like colorful elements. For example, in the PKK ideology and the set of thoughts, it was forbidden for male and female to have any sort of relation, let's say. And in Syria, there is a lot of tolerance towards YPG female and male to get married, much more than there was in the past. So we see that in a way, the Syrian context has forced the PKK to decentralize in some way its structure to some extent. But, and I mean, that is not, that sort of localization of actors in the conflict, it's not an unusual phenomenon. I mean, it's the same also that happened with the regime, and is happening also with the regime in specifically this area. Also, the regime had to localize in this area, delegate to national defense forces their security. It could not be there with an entire army. It retreated for this reason. It was much easier to, let's say, delocalize and say, okay, I will delegate to national defense force, which are made of local people from this area, the task of securing the area. And same thing, the security service of the regime are highly decentralized in this area. Historically, in Jazeera, the security service of intelligence, I mean, there are different branches, but I'm not going into the details of that, but they have high power of decision-making in the area, not in total autonomy, but let's say in having more autonomy from Damascus than other security branches. So what happened is a localization of players rather than a real decentralization of administration. But unfortunately, I will say that this highly centralized structure like the PKK and the regime, they both do not have interest in making the local administrations blossom to some extent. They both have interest in keeping the administration at the minimum level, and here, as you mentioned, many people claim that the level of life is not that good in this administration because both the PKK-related institutions and the regime state institutions which are still present there are two systems of governance which are one beside the other, but neither of them it's really succeeding in providing governance. They are just there with their military and security apparatus for their regional and national security interest, basically. But and in the meanwhile, the society really suffers. I mean, youth is compelled to or either emigrate or go to military service, or either in one side or in another. Then you have the urban middle class, which is basically neutralized. The society is completely neutralized. Those one who have the skill to build a local administration are still under the payroll of the Syrian state, but they, at the same time, many times they don't work because they're prevented from, for example, teaching in this or cooperating with this PYD institutions. So in some way, there is a situation where both systems are present with their security structure, but neither of them its wishes to develop a local governance. And both of them are very interested, I think, in developing actually that security element. To link up with what has been said also before, the role of the external players, it has been also very important in preventing the blossom of this administration. Because the wishes of the coalition to fight ISIS, it has led the Pentagon and other actors in a way to invest a lot into the military support of the YPG, which, of course, by investing in military support in the YPG with no plan of what to do with this administration that they have produced, they basically reinforced the dynamic of military control over this institution. And so, but at the same time, the problem was also that giving support to the civilian institution that they created would have also risked to also boost and consolidate the PKK military side. So they didn't do also they didn't support also the civilian institution because there was this problem at the base. But indeed, the military support for the PKK, it has increasingly encouraged the PKK in Syria to invest in military expansion, disregard the support for the civilian institution, strengthen the security grip over its own Kurdish society and other society living under its administration, and so basically working against decentralization rather than working towards decentralization. And so I think that the biggest question that remains now, which so far this US administration has not resolved, is how we can deal with that. I mean, now we are almost at the end of the anti-ISIL campaign. Like after the Raqqa operation, what do we do with this civilian structure they create? What do we do with this local military branch of the YPG that they create? There has been not yet, I think, a formula, a successful formula that has been found, but I think we will have to cope after the anti-ISIS campaign will finish. We will have to cope with some of the contradiction of this coalition support toward the YPG, and specifically the fact that there has been an enormous boost for the military side, and also there has been an enormous support for YPG expanding in areas which are not Kurdish, and which will create a lot of problem, despite locals are like nominally in charge, but in reality the YPG continue to be the main channel of decision making and power and receiving direct support. So we will have to cope with this problem, I think, in the next months. Thank you.
Okay. مشان صراحة صار في ضيق بالوقت لحد ما.
We do not have any more a lot of time. This is why I will ask questions to my colleagues, and then we will open the discussion with the audience. The emergence of the local councils and the experiences of those local councils, be it in the opposition areas or the regime-controlled areas, or the radicalism-controlled areas, or the PKK-controlled areas, is really very interesting. But if you wanted to look into the situation in Syria in terms of the centralized administration and the local councils, we would see that in 2016 there was a focus on Damascus from international organizations like opening some bureaus and offices in Damascus, and the regime had also had a lot of military advances recently, which strengthen the role of centralization, because financing would come to Damascus, or decentralization would take place in Damascus in terms of the humanitarian aid. And if Aleppo is taken back by the regime, it means more centralization in Damascus. But what are the available options? What can strengthen the local authorities? So what are the available options with the scenario of the coming back of centralization to Syria? I'm talking about the local councils, the leaders in those councils. What are the options that are available to them in case the centralization goes back to Damascus, or appears once again in Damascus?
Yep, great. I don't know how to attach this. Just hold it. Whatever. I mean, I think that if political authority is re-centralized in Damascus, I feel like it's difficult to imagine a role for some of these local structures, if only because they, in themselves, represent, even in their most anodyne, kind of service-focused forms, they necessarily represent a challenge to the legitimacy of the Assad regime and to one of its central claims to power, which is its continuing institutional function and the delivery of services, electricity, salaries across the country. It obviously has very little tolerance for these structures. My understanding is what has happened in areas that has cleared and briefed Damascus is that the regime has organized the evacuation of combatants, but it has also classed large sections of civilians as irreconcilable militants, basically. And so the local council officials who had been kind of point people for outside relief organizations, that they have also been bussed up to Idlib. So these are not bodies that the regime can tolerate. They also, particularly as the opposition is increasingly constricted within Idlib and the surrounding areas. In Idlib specifically, the opposition and its backers have never been fully successful in terms of standing up an alternative to the regime's institutions. Aleppo was a much better case in this respect. because there you had a strong provincial council. It had real authority. It had kind of represented the various regions of the province. And in Idlib, it's just not really. I mean, the provincial council, it does work. It has a role. But there's never been anything that's really been able to kind of knit together the authority above that local level. And I think that you've had roughly similar experiences in Hama and Latakia. I'm not that familiar with the South, so I can't really speak to that. Yeah, so it's difficult to know where you go from there once the locus of this assistance runs back through Damascus. I also would say, can I add something on the issue of? Oh yeah, sure. I have something on the in terms of the disconnect between the military and civilian support for the YPG. So one thing that I've seen in Idlib and that I know is also the case elsewhere is that I think, particularly in terms of these development contractors, which again they provide more expansive support for kind of really developing municipal service capabilities. They are very sensitive. So the ones with the most generous support have a political objective, and they're very sensitive to issues of armed group control. So what happens in Idlib is that, I mean, they're worried about reputational benefit, and they're worried about material support to designated terrorist organizations. So in this instance, Jabhat Fath-Sham, as well as, I guess, Jund al-Aqsa, if it still exists. But also just armed group control more generally, which is why they have not, to my knowledge, cooperated with the Jaish al-Fatah Authority. They have not worked together with the Ahrar Sham-backed body, despite that body's overtures to outside donors. And I think that they have, so far, they've had some of these organizations, they've had a tricky relationship with the YPG, which I know in at least some instances has confiscated equipment from local councils, from civil defense in areas of its control areas that it's captured, and then I think is seen as controlling local governance bodies in a way that is more explicit and direct within the autonomous administration or within kind of Rojava than you get in the Northwest. And you also, I think that there are also, I am still, there may also be sanctions concerns in the Northeast, just in terms of the PKK, the designation of the PKK. I know that at least on the military side, the YPG is considered, let's see, the way that a coalition spokesman put it to me, the YPG is a valued partner in the fight against ISIS. It is not vetted. It is not considered fully vetted under the relevant defense authorization. It's unclear why, but I think that is why direct military support typically runs through the Syrian Arab Coalition, which are these kind of smaller Arab auxiliaries. The supplies, I mean, in contrast with with airstrikes. So that's at least that's what they're willing to acknowledge. And I think that you may run into some of the same tricky issues in terms of their civilian structures.
Hello. Okay. I tend to find it. I tend to find. خليني أحكي بالعربي عفوا أنا آسف. يعني السؤال أنا رأيي
I think that the question is not related to a real situation. It's important to know what the situation of the regime is currently and to read the landscape accurately, because even the Center of Studies, which is present in Damascus, notices that we have a kind of discrepancies between the administrative structure and economic structure, because even if the rebels remain in the remote areas, and if centralization is back, we know that the regime is unable to manage all those regions because it's fractioned. We have military forces in the Syrian Arab army, which decided to become dissidents to follow other factions. All this to say that now we have militias, and the presence of militias, and to say nothing of the 41 foreign factions, and here I'm talking of the factions which support the government and the regime. And in more than a case, when relief was distributed and services were distributed, we were able to notice that the regime in Damascus is unable to control its own systems and the own security apparatus, which is under the control of the Russian forces, to say nothing of the Iranian intelligence. Of course, there are some apparatus which are still controlled by the regime, but even if Aleppo and Idlib are recovered, in the worst case scenario, I don't think that the regime has the structural capacity to manage those areas. Therefore, it will resort to other means, either by nominating local people, granting them some powers, and we will go back to localization. So I think, as I said, that there's a horizontal and vertical fragmentation on the social, security, and military levels. When we say that the opposition is fragmented, I think that the regime is more fragmented than the opposition, and this is the view of many Syrians. Then who is going to, what is he going to govern? What place is Daraya, where we have no more people left? What was the number of, or the population of Aleppo? 2 million? They say we have currently 300,000 or 350,000. What is he going to govern? When I was talking to the governor of Homs about the number of the original citizens who came back, he answered no more than 20%. So who this system is going to rule? And here we have the theory of the genie that we cannot put back in his bottle. So all these ethnic belongings who were suppressed, and we also have the Sunna component, which was a majority. So all these genies left their bottle. We will not be able to bring back to this bottle. So this tissue in Syria, the social tissue was a mere painting, but behind this beautiful painting we had fragmentation. The national identity was not an entrenched identity. We used to say we're Syria, but what Syria are we talking about? The Syria of Assad? We did not have this national identity which include all the Syrians. I think that we will need another meeting on this, whether the regime takes back his powers or comes back, regardless of the head of the pyramid in Syria. I think that what we have currently is not sustainable. Thank you.
Hello? Yes. Oh, sorry. So I will answer your question first and then just briefly. I know we don't have a lot of time. I think on the issue of the northeast Syria, so mostly the area of Jazeera, the problem is not, the issue is not whether the regime will come back with strength. I don't think that the regime is interested to run again this area, but I think we can expect a pattern of continuity with what has been always the approach of the regime in this towards the Jazeera, which is keeping the Jazeera and other Kurdish populated area underdeveloped and dependent. So these two words, underdeveloped and independent. So basically, we are not talking about the fact that they are going to go back there with, I don't think even they have the need to go back there with or the capacity to go back there. And in this, I agree with what has been said before. But the fact that they don't have the ability to go back socially and militarily does not mean that the other side will succeed. Does not mean that the local administration then will succeed. It might be that you continue to have a sort of situation in these areas similar to what you had in the embargo in the 90s in Iraq, a minimum stage of survival. You know, we keep day by day, we keep you like slightly alive, but dependent, and not for you it's not possible to develop beyond that stage. Quoting one teacher of Kamishli, he was saying the regime wants us to remain fallahin. He wants us to remain peasants. He doesn't, this is what they want eventually, and this is much more risky than actually the bombing in his opinion. So saying the regime in the opposition area has used active violence, bombing and repression. In the Kurdish area, it has used passive violence, dependency and underdevelopment. And then over the issue, of the issue of the support, the military support to the YPG, I think few will disagree with the argument that say that the military support to the YPG, it has drawn the YPG and PKK closer the way it is. But I think that there is potential to draw them apart also. So we have to understand how to draw them apart. And part of this might be to invest into a different type of military support, which does not go through the same people that it's going, because it is going, like coordination at least on airstrike, as you say, it's going through Syrian PKK people. And at the same time, investing into civilian institutions. But indeed, if you now, the humanitarian and the international organization, say, we want to rebuild Jazeera, if you go and support things the way that they are, I think it will be even worse. So, and also I think we have to, maybe in the discussion, to open just one thing that, the humanitarian role, the humanitarian organization role, it sometimes can be very counterproductive in these situations. It can solidify situations of military control over civilians. So I think we should reflect on this.
اوكي نبدأ من هون. الميكروفون الأسئلة بيجاوبوا عليهم بس ممكن باختصار مشان ناخذ جولة ثانية إذا بتريد.
Hello, does this work? Can you hear me? Is it working?
دقيقة.
Yeah, it's working. My first question, the questions can be combined to Sam. Sohaila Hayek, to Sam and to Maria. Sam, from what you said, it seems like, just like Maria just mentioned, all of these local governance bodies in the Idlib province, if they didn't have all this aid to distribute, where is their source of power? Could they provide food? Could they provide? Or is it just the foreign aid that gives them that power? And to Maria, how do they run this area in Jazeera in terms of budget? Do they tax people? Do they have foreign? And in general, what is the source of running all these local and provincial bodies? Who is funding all of this?
سؤال العميد الياس فرحات.
General Yes Farhat, what is the relationship between governmental institutions and local councils? Is there a specific relationship between them? For instance, how teachers in Raqqa and Idlib receive their salaries, how electricity and water are distributed. Is there a relationship between the central government and the local councils which are affiliated to the opposition in those areas?
Student at Northwestern. I had a question for Maria, very briefly. Could you speak a little bit about what seems to be the irredentist project of the PKK and YPG in Syria, northern Syria, to take over areas that they see as having been colonized by the Arab belt in the 60s and 70s by the Ba'ath regime? Thank you.
No.
Is this working? Yep. So I would say that in terms of the local councils, they do have credibility and social power that's independent of their foreign assistance. To varying degrees, I think that many do have kind of democratic or semi-democratic popular buy-in and legitimacy in these towns. I think that the fact that in these towns that are bombed semi-regularly, that are not perfectly livable, the fact that many of the people that many of these local council officials, many of whom are themselves educated, who could live elsewhere, the fact that they've stayed and that they continue to serve their communities, I think that buys them goodwill. In material terms, they seem to be self-sustaining to varying degrees. I don't think I heard about any that were able to collect taxes properly, but certainly some have revenue-generating projects, or they're able to collect jabaya, or like fees for utilities, for bread, with which they're able to cover their own expenses or to defray their costs. That seems in practice to translate into kind of more political and operational independence of donors. And it also has implications for the ability of armed groups to make inroads into these councils, because it seems that they've had the best luck of linking up with and co-opting some of these councils in instances where the council's support is incomplete or it is unreliable. Those are the councils that are the most vulnerable to an armed group linked body that may come in and then offer wages, for example, or will kind of sponsor like a more involved service project.
How funded? How are these funded?
The armed group bodies? I am frankly unclear. I think that at least with the Nusra body, or the Fath Sham body, they said that they have their own domestic sources of funding. They told me that they could not say what they are because they were afraid that they would be targeted. Yeah, and then I know that with the Jaish al-Fatah body, then they were able to collect fees on some of their services, but then I don't know if there are other kind of revenue streams or funding that's chipped in by some of the constituent factions. In terms of the second question, so the link between so the institutions of the Syrian state and local government, yes, to my knowledge, salaries continue to be paid to many public sector employees in these areas, teachers in particular. But I also heard about some employees on municipal staffs, maintenance teams, who would continue to collect salaries. The issue is that to do it, at least that of Idlib, I don't know where you'd have to go to collect it elsewhere. From Idlib to do it, you have to go down to Hama City. There are a number of checkpoints on the way. You have to cross the lines into regime territory. There's a risk of arrest, and also because the value of a government salary is so depleted by the weakened Syrian lira, it's not obvious that it's worth it anymore, that it's worth the trip. And then a lot of the salary that you collect will be, you'll lose it on checkpoint bribes. So that's a big part of it. You do also have there are other kind of service and institutional linkages between these areas. So in at least some instances, then the regime has fielded electrical service teams up into the north. Electricity, in fact, seems to be a major, the electricity infrastructure seems to be a major thing that holds some of these areas together. It's part of how Jabhat al-Nusra, Jabhat Fath Hasham has distinguished itself is with its maintenance and service of key nodes of the electricity infrastructure, which runs up from Hama through eastern deserts in East Idlib, South Aleppo, and then up to Aleppo City. And they also maintain nodes of the electricity infrastructure elsewhere, that kind of secondary nodes within Idlib. And at least in that respect, then it does seem like there is some degree of coordination and cooperation between armed groups and between the Syrian government on what is just one set of utilities infrastructure, at least on electricity.
Yes, on the issue of the budget, actually, I mean, I had a list of all the sources of budget of the self-administration, but I have not with me now, so I'm going to give you just some of the... Yeah, no, I mean, basically the administration itself, it's a source of income in the sense that, first of all, the border control between Iraq and Syria. This is an enormous amount. I mean, they are the only group who is controlling on the Syrian side this border in the very northeastern area. So just to give some visual, this land between the Syrian side and the Iraq side, it's flat land. It's one of the, like, it's a golden opportunity for smugglers because you can just cross from one side to the other. And also for traders, it's a good, I mean, you can trade things from one side to another. It has been historically, since that border has been established, a good source of income for whoever has controlled that area. So, for instance, that the border control, it's the first, they take, I think, daraib, so taxes from the border control. So this on one hand, so the border control taxes, then I think there is a lot of smuggling, but they are not the only one who benefit. Also the Iraqi side is smuggling. So, for example, if they need generators, electric generators, because they don't have enough electricity in the Jazeera, they smuggle generators from Iraq, and I think both sides have an income on that. And then there is the oil from Rumelan, but it's a very, I mean, it's not that they actually have a problem, that they have a lot of oil in that area, but they don't have the refinery and then they don't have the pathways to basically trade it, if I'm not wrong. I mean, I'm not an expert in oil export, but I think that is what I have understood. But what they do is that they pump some oil, and then they, with a very rudimentary mechanism, they transform it into mazot, into diesel, and they sell these things for, I don't know, for an amount to the local population. Also, this is another source of income. So they're self-funded. Then if they receive also other funding, I'm not sure about, but already this, I had a colleague of mine who had calculated the amount of all that, including ship smuggling, border control, all this, and it was, I mean, a great amount of money. So, and then just briefly the project of the, what is the project? The project has nothing to do with the, I mean, if you talk about what's the project of the PKK, we can stay here days and years maybe, but because it's a very complex project, which also has, depending on to whom you speak from that movement, it will give you different answer. But indeed, it has not started in Syria to be a project which was aimed at de-Arabizing that area at all. No. It started not as it started actually as a strategic project. PKK wanted to be inside Syria in this corner because it was strategic for its interest, for its struggle against Turkey. So that was the main point. Then the fact that they found a good environment there to also implement some of the ideas of the PKK founder Abdullah Öcalan, that is another issue, and that indeed also is another important component. And in this project, as you might know, I mean, it's not based on Kurdish nationalism. Abdullah Öcalan project is based on, yeah, I mean, it's inspired by socialism, but it's also inspired, there are main principles like gender equality, ecology, and self-governance, and all that. But I would say that the priority at the very beginning and until now, as long as the military side will lead, it's to have a strategic anchor against Turkey, and specifically now, it's mostly to control as much as possible the entirety of the Syrian-Turkish border. This is even more important than implementing the Abdullah Öcalan thoughts. There is, just the last thing, there is within the PKK Syrian branch people who have been recently recruited who are believing that actually the priority is not that one of the struggle against Turkey, but the priority is to build and consolidate a structure of governance in Syria. So there is a sort of double voice also inside the movement.
Go ahead, we will take another round of questions. Thank you. Thank you. Could you introduce yourself? Eva Zaidan. You focused on the areas that are controlled by the opposition and the areas that are controlled by the Kurdish. And we considered that the regime-controlled areas are apart, as if they remained as they were before the 2011 events. Whereas we know that many changes occurred, many cities have now different roles, and even many other areas started having their own local councils, and even some denominations started having an increased role in the local administration. However, you did not tackle this, and I would have liked you to talk about those areas, the areas that are controlled by the regime. And we should not forget that Law 107 on local administration was written before 2011. So the persons who wrote down this law and fought for this law existed before 2011. Why shouldn't we take into consideration all this in order to unify the different parts of Syria which implement the same law without insisting on separation and on laying responsibilities on one party at the expense of another party, whereas we know what the extent of the disaster is currently.
Philip Sheet, is there a role for non-Kurdish in the area, non-Kurdish citizens in the administration and public life in the Kurdish areas?
ناخد بس أنا بس أوكي ممكن نوقف هون بس ممكن نوضح شيء بخصوص
I would like to clarify one point regarding the question of the lady. The researchers who are with us do not represent the Kurds or the opposition. They are researchers who worked on some issues and who analyzed them. Of course, the regime-controlled areas need, of course, an in-depth study in order to understand what happened during these 5 years. But here we're studying a case that is outside the formal structure that we know. In all the state, in all the region-controlled areas, there was no new organizations or structures, and our colleague did not focus on the regime-controlled areas, but he focused on the emergence of this new administration in Syria. I do not know if this question is addressed to me, but in the Omran Center we have consecrated a part of our study to the Kurd regions, because these new areas of power which are being consolidated, be it in Jarablus or in regions under the Euphrates or the Kurds region, or the regions in Sahel, which are different from the region in Damascus in terms of administration. I think that at the end of the day, these areas have to be framed within a political decision and support to the political process. And then these areas that are not yet determined, even in terms of their borders, can allow the return of the social cohesion to Syria. But they have, of course, to have a similar organization, and I think that this exists already in the opposition-controlled areas, and here maybe the term of opposition is a little bit large. It is rather a bottom-up approach. I think that this is available. I do not know if I answered your question. Thank you. Last point, please.
Non-Kurdish representative also participate into the administration. But I mean, the problem, if we are talking about just the canton, let's say, not the Arab areas like Manbij, Tel Aviv, I mean, we are talking about just the canton. Okay. In the canton, there are also, for example, Arab representatives or Christian representative. The problem is that they face the same problem as their Kurdish fellows, that they are not, they don't have real decision-making power. So we come back here. So the problem is not about inclusivity, because I mean they are inclusive. I mean, if you see the name of the people, they have all communities, but the problem is the system, both towards Kurdish officials and towards non-Kurdish. It's a system of cooptation without real decision-making power. So that I think it's the problem.
ناخذ هلا الجلسة الثانية الساعة 2 بعد 3.
The next session will be held at 2, so in 45 minutes, who will continue the discussion with other researchers, but they will be talking more about the geopolitical context of the situation. Thank you a lot.